The Soviet soldiers stationed outside Berlin in the summer of 1948 thought they knew what was coming. They had seen these aircraft before, massive, four-engine American planes droning over the city in formation, just like in 1944 and 1945. Back then, they had carried destruction. The heavy thunder of B-17s and B-24s, the night-black silhouettes that dropped thousands of tons of bombs on Nazi Germany. Now, 3 years later, those same shapes appeared again over the gray ruins of Berlin. The men on the ground raised binoculars, waiting for explosions. But nothing fell. No flames, no debris. Only white parachutes descending slowly through the cold air, and below them, sacks of flour, powdered milk, and coal briquettes. For many of those soldiers, the sight made no sense. The Americans had come back to Berlin, but this time they were fighting hunger instead of an enemy. Soviet intelligence officers logged the event with disbelief, the Western Allies using their bombers to feed the very people they had once destroyed. To some in Moscow's command structure, it looked like psychological warfare, a propaganda stunt. To the Americans and British aircrews flying out of Wiesbaden, Celle, and Fossberg, it was a lifeline to 2 million civilians trapped behind a blockade. This paradox, bombers turned into bread carriers, was the opening act of the Berlin Airlift, one of the most extraordinary logistical operations in modern history. Between June 1948 and September 1949, the Western Allies flew over 277,000 missions into the divided city, delivering more than 2 million tons of food, fuel, and medical supplies. But in those early weeks, confusion and suspicion clouded every move. Soviet radar stations tracked each incoming aircraft as if preparing for a new war. On the ground, Red Army observers reported the flights to Moscow, unsure whether this was a prelude to confrontation or something stranger, an act of mercy carried out with military precision. The crisis had begun with a decision in the Kremlin. In March 1948, Joseph Stalin ordered a series of restrictions on Allied rail and road access to West Berlin, hoping to force Britain, France, and the United States to abandon their zones in the city. The Soviet Union controlled all the surrounding territory of East Germany, and by cutting off supplies, Stalin aimed to starve the western sectors into submission. The move came after growing tensions over currency reform and political influence. For Washington, it was the first major test of post-war resolve, not on a battlefield, but in the fragile heart of a divided Europe. When Soviet guards halted a U.S. military supply train on June 24th, the Western Allies realized they faced an ultimatum: withdraw or find another way to keep Berlin alive. General Lucius D. Clay, the American military governor, refused to yield. "We stay in Berlin, period," he wrote. But without access by land, there was only one path left: the air. That idea sounded almost impossible. Berlin's western sectors had 2 small airfields, Tempelhof and Gatow, both surrounded by rubble and refugees. Feeding and heating 2 million people by air required moving about 5,000 tons of supplies every single day, a figure that dwarfed anything achieved during wartime resupply missions. Yet within days, the first flights began. C-47 Skytrains, the same aircraft that had once dropped paratroopers over Normandy, now carried flour and baby formula instead of ammunition. Their engines, twin Pratt & Whitney R-1830s, roared down the same flight paths once used for bombing runs. To the Soviets monitoring from the ground, the symbolism was unavoidable. The sky that had once burned with war now carried the hum of aid. Soviet newspapers dismissed the operation as a futile gesture, predicting it would collapse within weeks. But inside the aircraft, crews worked with the discipline of combat missions. Pilots flew on tight schedules, sometimes landing every 90 seconds, guided by makeshift radio beacons and the glow of oil lamps on the runway. They nicknamed it Operation Vittles, but the humor masked the tension. Each takeoff brushed close to the edge of Soviet-controlled airspace. American, British, and even Australian crews joined the effort. The British used their Avro Yorks and Dakotas. The Americans brought in the larger C-54 Skymasters, each capable of carrying 10 tons per trip. By mid-July, hundreds of aircraft were streaming through 3 narrow air corridors agreed upon during the occupation. Soviet fighters shadowed them, but never fired. The world held its breath, waiting to see who would blink first. Among the Soviet units stationed near Brandenburg, a rumor began to spread that the Western Allies were secretly rearming Berlin under the guise of humanitarian aid. Soviet maintenance crews at the nearby Fino air base logged daily sightings of American bombers, unable to shake the image of past air raids. But when they intercepted a few parachute drops and opened the containers, they found flour, not weapons. Even seasoned intelligence officers were left baffled. What did it mean when the same engines that once carried destruction now delivered sustenance? To men raised in total war, the gesture seemed almost surreal, even suspicious. Yet the operation continued to grow. Each day that the Soviet blockade held, the sound of those engines over Berlin grew louder, and with it a new kind of message took shape, one not written in treaties or ideology, but in tonnage and flight hours. The soldiers on the ground could only watch as the sky filled with aircraft once feared, now welcomed. Some began to call them the raisin bombers, after pilots started dropping candy parachutes for German children. What had begun as disbelief was slowly turning into something else, curiosity, even respect. But behind that fragile calm, danger still lingered. Stalin's patience was wearing thin, and the Western Allies were pushing their logistics to the breaking point. Could the airlift truly keep a city alive through an entire winter? Or would it end with the crash of one too many Skymasters in the frozen night? The first months of the Berlin airlift were chaos disguised as order. In the control towers of Wiesbaden and Fassberg, American and British officers worked without rest, charting hundreds of sorties a day through narrow air corridors that sliced across Soviet territory like invisible wires. Every 3 minutes, a plane took off. Every 3 minutes, another touched down in Berlin. The rhythm was mechanical, almost industrial. Yet behind each flight was a fragile calculation of weight, weather, and endurance. The airlift's early days pushed both men and machines to their limits. The C-47 Skytrain, a reliable veteran of World War II, could carry barely 3 tons of cargo, a fraction of what Berlin needed. So, within weeks, U.S. forces began replacing them with the more powerful C-54 Skymaster. Each of these 4-engine transports could haul up to 10 tons, powered by Pratt & Whitney R2000 engines that had once driven wartime bombers across Europe. On the ground, engineers modified the aircraft for cargo efficiency, removing passenger seats, reinforcing floors, and installing quick-release clamps for faster unloading. At Tempelhof, Berliners worked shoulder to shoulder with Allied soldiers, clearing debris and smoothing the runways. The city was still half in ruins, facades pocked with bullet holes, bridges collapsed, tram lines severed. Yet, amid that devastation, a new kind of logistics base emerged. Forklifts roared across the tarmac as ground crews unloaded sacks of coal, flour, and medical supplies in record time. Each plane had to be emptied and turned around within 30 minutes to maintain the tempo. Veterans of the war recognized the sound of those engines instantly, the deep, throaty hum of radial pistons echoing across the same neighborhoods that once shook under air raids. But now Berliners listened for that sound as a promise, not a threat. They counted each arrival like a heartbeat, a measure of survival. In August 1948, the tonnage rose from 700 tons per day to over 1,500. It wasn't enough to feed the whole city, but it was proof that the operation could scale, and that Stalin's blockade could be resisted without a single shot fired. Soviet command watched in mounting frustration. Field reports from observation posts described constant aircraft traffic resembling wartime formations. The Kremlin was certain the Allies could not sustain the effort through winter. They expected fuel shortages, mechanical failures, or simple fatigue to bring the operation down. What they underestimated was the Western capacity for organization and the morale that came from defiance. The U.S. Air Force began running the airlift like a precision campaign. Maintenance hangars in Frankfurt worked around the clock, swapping engines, replacing propellers, and rotating aircrews through sleep schedules measured in minutes. A few aircraft still bore the scars of war, patched bullet holes, faded serial numbers, silent reminders of how quickly the world had changed. At night, pilots followed the flickering glow of beacons along the corridor, flying by instruments through fog so thick it swallowed the city lights. Every flight risked disaster: icing, low visibility, overloaded engines straining under their cargo. Crash records from those months read like a grim litany of sacrifice. In November 1948 alone, 25 crewmen were lost. Some planes clipped buildings in the dense Berlin haze. Others stalled under the weight of fuel drums. Yet not once did the mission stop. "We weren't warriors anymore," one pilot recalled, "but we still flew like our lives depended on it, because someone else's did." The airlift also became a contest of endurance between two systems. Soviet commanders tried subtle interference: false radio signals, searchlights blinding pilots, even low-flying fighters shadowing transports to test their reactions. But direct aggression was off the table. No one wanted to trigger another war so soon after the last one. So the conflict remained one of logistics and willpower, fought in silence above the clouds. To the men on the ground, both Soviet and German, the sight was haunting. The very aircraft that had once dropped bombs on Dresden and Hamburg were now symbols of mercy. A Soviet colonel reportedly told an interpreter, "The Americans have learned to turn their war machines into peace machines." Whether he meant it as admiration or irony, no one could tell. By autumn, the scale of the operations stunned even its planners. In a single day, more than 1,000 flights crossed into Berlin's airspace. The U.S. 513th Airlift Division began referring to their own transport crews with the same respect once reserved for bomber squadrons. Loadmasters replaced gunners. Bags of flour replaced ammunition belts. The transformation was as much moral as mechanical. In the hangars, surplus weapons sat idle. M60 machine guns, MG42s, M240s, relics of a war that was already becoming history. Engineers joked that their best weapon now was the propeller. But the humor masked a quiet pride. For once, airpower was saving lives instead of taking them. Still, doubts lingered in Washington and London. Could this improvised miracle keep Berlin alive through winter when heating fuel would triple in demand? Even as the planes roared overhead, political tensions deepened. Moscow refused all negotiations. The Soviet press accused the Allies of militarizing the skies. And in the West, fears grew that a single incident, a mid-air collision or a Soviet interception, could ignite a new world war. Yet each successful delivery, each ton of food safely landed, eroded that fear a little more. The operation's quiet success began to reshape the political landscape. Berlin, once a symbol of defeat, was becoming a symbol of resistance and cooperation. But as December snow began to fall, the airlift faced its first true test: the bitter cold of a German winter that threatened to freeze the engines, the fuel, and the fragile hope keeping the city alive. The winter of 1948 hit Berlin like a siege. Temperatures plunged below freezing, the canals turned to ice, and the city's skeletal power grid began to fail. Inside the bombed-out buildings, families burned furniture for warmth. Everything depended on the sky now, the silver wings that traced faint lines through the gray air. The same sound that once sent civilians running for cover was now the sound of life itself. By December, Operation Vittles had become a massive, unbroken relay of engines, men, and willpower. Each C-54 Skymaster groaned under 10 tons of coal, packed into canvas sacks that stained the air with fine black dust when unloaded. Coal was heavier than food and far more dangerous to carry. Its dust was combustible, its weight unpredictable. Flight engineers calculated every kilogram, adjusting trim tabs and fuel ratios to the decimal. Pilots compared notes on black snow, the grime that coated their uniforms after each run. They joked grimly that the Berlin Airlift might kill them slowly, one lungful at a time. But they kept flying, and with each flight, the logistical miracle deepened. The U.S. Air Force built new runways at Tempelhof and Tegel, the latter constructed almost entirely by Berlin civilians, many of them women who had already rebuilt their own homes from rubble. They worked 12-hour shifts, laying down steel matting and clearing debris with bare hands. Soviet patrols watched from a distance, unable to intervene but recording every movement in notebooks, later sent to Moscow. The blockade had been intended to break morale, but instead it hardened resolve. When Soviet authorities cut off electricity, Berlin's western sectors powered makeshift generators, using fuel flown in by the same aircraft that delivered flour and milk. The numbers were staggering. In January 1949 alone, Allied planes delivered nearly 200,000 tons of supplies, more than the total monthly tonnage of some wartime bombing campaigns. Still, every day was a fight against physics. Fog rolled in from the Havel River, icing over wings and blinding the approach beacons. The air corridors were narrow, only 20 miles wide, and packed with hundreds of aircraft at staggered altitudes. One navigation error could cause catastrophe. The crews called it the Steel Sky. To manage the chaos, Air Traffic Command in Frankfurt introduced a new precision scheduling system. One takeoff every 3 minutes, one landing every 3 minutes, 24 hours a day. The rhythm became hypnotic, unrelenting. Inside the cockpits, the heat from the engines barely kept the frost off the glass. Pilots flew by instruments through dense fog, the altimeters trembling as they dropped into Berlin's freezing air. The city below was still a wasteland. Skeletal trees, broken bridges, fields of debris where factories once stood. Yet the runways gleamed like arteries of light, lined with flares and signal lamps. Each time a plane landed safely, Berliners cheered. They knew the sound of the Skymaster engines by heart. Children could distinguish between a C-54 and a Dakota just by the rhythm of the propellers. Among those children was 7-year-old Peter Zimmermann, who remembered the candy parachutes dropped by a pilot the Germans would later call Onkel Wackelflügel, Uncle Wiggly Wings. His real name was Gail Halverson, an American transport pilot who began secretly dropping small packages of chocolate and gum attached to handkerchief parachutes. His act of kindness became legend and then official policy. Soon other pilots joined in, turning the skies over Berlin into a quiet rain of sweets. For the first time in years, the children of Berlin looked up, not in fear, but in joy. In the Soviet-occupied eastern sector, propaganda officers struggled to counter the narrative. They accused the Allies of corrupting youth with capitalist candy. But the contrast was impossible to hide. The western airfields glowed with activity, while the eastern city remained cold and dim. Soviet soldiers, once convinced the airlift would fail, began to admit among themselves that the Americans had done something extraordinary, something that defied the logic of war. Inside Soviet headquarters, reports grew uneasy. Marshal Sokolovsky, the commander of Soviet forces in Germany, warned Moscow that the blockade was backfiring. The western sectors were becoming symbols of endurance, the Soviet-controlled areas symbols of isolation. But Stalin refused to yield. His orders were simple: let them fly until they fall. And fall they sometimes did. The worst crashes came in the fog-choked days of February 1949, when visibility dropped below 50 meters. A British Avro York clipped a building near the Tempelhof approach, killing its entire crew. 2 days later, an American C-54 went down near Wiesbaden after engine failure. The wreckage froze into the snow like monuments to endurance. But the losses did not slow the effort. Every pilot understood what was at stake. They were not flying for glory or territory, but for the principle that a city could not be starved into submission. By spring, the airlift had become the most successful peacetime military operation in history. Engineers had solved nearly every logistical problem once thought impossible. They introduced ground radar guidance, redesigned coal packaging to reduce weight shifts, and perfected synchronized loading systems that cut turnaround time to 15 minutes. The sky above Germany became a machine, a humming lattice of purpose. Yet even as the numbers rose, one question still hung in the air. How long could this dance between mercy and endurance last before someone or something broke the pattern? By April 1949, the noise over Berlin had become a kind of permanent weather. The deep thunder of the engines never stopped. Day and night, in rain and snow, the air above the divided city vibrated with the pulse of piston-driven mercy. Pilots described it as flying inside a great metallic heartbeat, relentless, alive, and utterly fragile. The numbers told their own story. More than 10,000 tons of supplies were now being delivered every single day, double the amount needed to sustain Berlin's 2 million inhabitants. The statistics alone staggered observers. Over 200,000 flights, hundreds of aircraft cycling through a seamless system that reached peak efficiency by the spring. The operation's once impossible target had not only been met, but exceeded. The blockade, meant to break the West, was breaking instead under the weight of its own failure. On May 12, 1949, after nearly a year of stalemate, Stalin finally relented. Soviet authorities lifted the land blockade, reopening the roads and railways to West Berlin. Officially, Moscow claimed it was a gesture of goodwill. In truth, the blockade had backfired spectacularly. The Western Allies had not only held their ground, they had transformed an act of aggression into a triumph of humanitarian engineering. But the planes didn't stop that day. General William Tunner, the veteran of the hump airlift over the Himalayas during World War II, ordered the flights to continue until full confidence was restored. For 3 more months, the Skymasters and Yorks kept flying, just in case the Soviets tried to close the gates again. When the final tally was recorded that September, the Berlin Airlift had delivered more than 2.3 million tons of cargo. Food, fuel, medicine, and hope, at a cost of 101 lives. The scale of coordination remains unmatched in aviation history. Every element, from the maintenance depots to the weather stations, had evolved into a living organism. Tunner's reforms, drawn from combat logistics, turned chaos into clockwork. Pilots followed color-coded flight plans, ground crews rotated on 4-hour shifts, and controllers tracked hundreds of simultaneous flights on grease pencil boards that resembled military maps. It was war infrastructure rebuilt for peace. For the Soviet soldiers who had first watched the sky fill with American aircraft in disbelief, the ending carried a strange symmetry. They had expected bombs and received bread. They had predicted collapse and witnessed endurance. In private reports later declassified from Soviet archives, officers admitted admiration for the technological and organizational mastery of the operation. One colonel described it as the use of war machines for peace, a kind of inversion of destruction. The Western Allies saw it the same way. The airlift became not just a relief mission, but a redefinition of power. The moment when air power proved it could defend without killing. In post-war strategic doctrine, that mattered deeply. The same engineering discipline that had built weapons like the MG-42 or the M60 machine gun, the same industrial genius that had produced bombers and tanks, was now proving that logistics could achieve what combat could not. And yet, it was no simple moral victory. The airlift hardened the division of Europe. It accelerated the formation of NATO, pushed the Soviets to consolidate their control in the East, and turned Berlin into the Cold War's permanent fault line. In the years that followed, American troops remained stationed in West Germany, and the skies that once carried flour and coal would soon carry reconnaissance planes and nuclear deterrence. The Cold War was born from this uneasy peace, forged by engines that had traded one mission for another. Still, something had changed in the human imagination. For the first time in modern warfare, the full machinery of destruction had been turned deliberately toward preservation. Pilots who once trained as bombers became messengers of survival. Engineers who built weapon systems now refined cargo logistics. Even the language of airpower shifted. Payload no longer meant ordnance, it meant life. Veterans of the airlift carried that lesson long after the operation ended. Many said they had never felt closer to the meaning of their service. We learned that the most powerful weapon, one airman reflected, was the ability to feed someone instead of shooting them. The candy bombers returned home as unlikely heroes, not for their kills, but for their kindness. In Berlin, the memory endured. At Tempelhof, a plaque still marks the place where the first American transport touched down in June 1948. Visitors walk beneath the shadow of the old hangars, imagining the sky alive with aircraft, the vibration, the noise, the endless rhythm that once kept a city alive. And in the museums that tell the story, one image repeats again and again. The sight of a German child waving at a descending parachute, a fragment of sweetness falling through the ruins. The Soviet soldiers who had once stared up in suspicion eventually moved on, their posts reassigned, their reports filed away in archives. Many never learned the names of the men who flew those missions. But they had seen something unforgettable, the transformation of air war into air mercy. The Berlin Airlift stands today not just as a feat of logistics, but as a warning and a promise. Technology is never fixed in purpose. The same wings that carry destruction can also carry compassion. The line between the two is drawn not by machinery, but by human intent. And as history keeps reminding us, from the machine guns of past wars to the supply convoys of modern peacekeeping, the true test of progress is not how effectively we fight, but how creatively we refuse to. The bombers had returned to Berlin, yes, but this time they came not to end lives, but to prove that even in the coldest divides of human history, the sky itself could be taught to deliver hope.